Welcome back to my channel. This video is going to discuss a couple of different ways that you can smooth and finish your 3D prints. I've got a few different techniques here, whether you're working with really large pieces, super detailed pieces, or pieces that have a little bit of both. This is part 5 in my series of building my Boba Fett cosplay out of all 3D printed pieces. If you're here to continue that series, I hope that you enjoy this video. And if you're just here to learn a little bit more about smoothing 3D prints, I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned and I hope you enjoy it. So the first thing I want to discuss in this video is some of the print positioning, because I haven't spoken on that yet in regards to the armor. I'll let this clip here of me removing supports sort of play as I describe this. You can see that a lot of these pieces I printed with rafts, normal supports with the support density very low. And I tried to make sure everything was standing up as much as possible. A lot of the armor like the chest and the shoulders has a slight curve to it. If you were to lay it down too flat, you'd have really bad stair stepping on top. Obviously the nozzle size and the layer height is totally up to you. I printed all of these pieces with a 0.6mm nozzle, and most of it I did in a thick quality, like a draft style quality. I was trying to print this as fast as I could. In probably the last part of this series, I'll go over some of the cost and print times just so you guys have an idea of that. You can see here that a lot of the pieces came out pretty good, but where the supports were connected, it's extremely rough. It is going to require a lot of sanding. Now I like to sand the raw print on pretty much every single print that I do. This usually starts with trying to get those really bad support areas all filed down. I'll use a Dremel, a file, even a soldering iron to try to melt it down. I like to do as much of it as I can with a palm sander, a mouse sander, or some sort of orbital sander, because that greatly reduces the time you're going to spend sanding. One tip I will give is if you keep that sander in one spot for too long, you are going to begin to warp the plastic or melt through the walls if you didn't print with very many walls. So just make sure that you keep that sander moving. I do then go in and hand sand any areas that I need to. Usually at this stage with a raw print, I'm hand sanding with 120 or maybe 320. Now when I went through to edit this video, I had like 5 hours of me just sanding all these parts and everything. Obviously I don't want this video to be 5 hours long, so a lot of the footage is going to be time-lapsed, or you're going to see multiple clips on the screen at the same time, or I'm just going to cut a whole bunch of it out. I want to give you guys an idea of what I did with the armor, but I also don't want to be redundant, since I did cover part smoothing on 3D prints in part 1 of this video when I prepped the helmet. I will also add that I did the helmet later, and I used UV resin smoothing on it, and I loved that technique, but that is not a technique that you're going to see in this video. So if you're not someone who's comfortable with UV resin, I'm going to try to give you as many tips and tricks that I can on smoothing 3D prints in this video. And if you are comfortable with UV resin and you're interested in making this Boba Fett, I recommend checking out this video because I'll try to give you some tips and tricks about specific pieces and issues that I had with them. I do like to wash all of the sanding dust off my prints, so you're going to see that a lot in this video. But you could also use a leaf blower or compressed air or something like that. I did do a little bit of a test when making this, and I finished some of these pieces different than I did others. I had a group of pieces of this armor that I absolutely loaded with Bondo glazing and spot putty right after the raw print sanding. If you're someone who likes Bondo, I do think Bondo is a good idea to use right after you sand the raw print because you're likely going to need it anyway, and if you do filler primer first, you could end up wasting that filler primer, but you'll see more on that later in some more tests. Using this Bondo glazing and spot putty is pretty simple. I just use some gloves and I'm very careful and rub it all around the entire piece. I had to go quick on this one because I was outside and the sun was trying to dry it too quick. I will say that these knees were one of the most difficult pieces on this armor to finish. What would have been smart is if I went in and mesh mixer and cut the little knee darts off of these and printed them separately and then glued them back in later. Trying to smooth these was an absolute struggle. I of course dumped lots of Bondo on the back piece that we welded together in the last video. Anytime you're combining parts and welding them together, you're going to have to do a lot of extra smoothing on those weld lines. You can absolutely sand Bondo with a power sander or even hand sand it outside. It's just that the dust makes a huge mess, so sometimes I do like to try to wet sand it if I can. I try to wet sand it whenever I can to reduce the Bondo dust that's going to spread around. You do not want to be breathing that in, make sure you're wearing a respirator. I'm usually very careful with the power sander when doing Bondo, and I try to hand sand and use sanding twigs whenever I can. For those super intricate details, you can use a little pick, almost like a dental tool, to be able to carve through the Bondo and get those details back. Those parts that I sanded outside, I still brought to the sink to wash, which is why I said you could just wet sand them in the first place. This back piece was probably too big to be wet sanding in there, but I did it anyway. Here we are at that other technique I told you that I was going to try, and that is just absolutely blasting these with filler primer right after the raw print sand. I tested this on a few of these pieces, and I would say for what you see here, I went through about an entire can of filler primer. That's between the jetpack, the rocket, the thrusters, the collar piece, and the VAM braces. Apologies if I'm going to call them gauntlets, it's probably going to happen. I will try to say VAM braces. Now on camera, these look like they're kind of smooth after the filler primer. I can assure you that they're not. But what I wanted to test was if I dumped them really heavy with filler primer, if I could go straight into my Boba Fett texturing, and that was definitely not the case. You probably could get away with it, but I personally just felt like they needed a lot more work before they were ready for anything else. So between these two techniques, my recommendation is to start with Bondo. However, you also saw me in the helmet using UV resin to smooth them, and I really do like that technique a lot. Back to those pieces that already got Bondo laid on thick and then sanded down. Those were now ready for filler primer. I say that like this is happening chronologically, but I do want you to know that some of these pieces were completely done and painted before other ones even came off the printer. It has been a lot of work sorting through these clips and trying to put them into some sort of order that makes sense for you guys. Anyway, ignore the helmet that you see here as I'm painting all these with filler primer, because that is actually not the helmet I used. That was going to be the helmet that I was going to use, and I felt like it was too big, so I printed a different one, which is the one that you guys saw me do the tutorial on in part 1 of this series. After all those pieces got this layer of filler primer, you can see them here. They are looking quite good, definitely better than the pieces that didn't get Bondo and went straight to filler primer. I do think that because we are going to be texturing these a lot, you potentially could stop here and maybe sand this filler primer and then go right into texturing. However, because I'm an absolute perfectionist and I cannot stand seeing any layer lines at all on my prints, I decided to take more steps. These got thoroughly sanded. I did a lot of hand sanding, I used sanding twigs, I mixed grits and I worked up in grits. You want to start with a little bit of a rougher grit and then increase the grit to be able to sand out the sanding lines from those lower grits. And once I felt like that layer was good, I of course washed it. You can kind of see here about how smooth these pieces were at this stage. Again, I probably could have stopped, but my big fear was when you prime a piece and it's all primed and sanded and it looks great, and then you spray metallic spray paint on it, those metallics do a great job at revealing all the little imperfections, and that metallic really catches the light and really makes your piece look super flawed. Later on in the part of the series, when I'm going to go through all the painting for every single one of these pieces, I'm going to discuss the metallics and the liquid mask and all of the sort of steps that I go through just like I did with the helmet. But because I wanted to be able to hit those metallics on there, I wanted to get this layer as smooth as possible. I'm not going to show much more of the rest of the remaining 5 to 6 hours worth of video that I have. I'm just going to try to give you guys a few more tips about sanding. First off, with a lot of these prints, I do like to start at about 120 to really get those thick layer lines out, but as I start laying down filler primer and Bondo, I don't usually do anything below 320, and then when you see me wet sanding, usually I'm using 600 as I'm wet sanding, especially if it's Bondo. Bondo is extremely easy to sand. You can lay it on super thick and still sand it down really well. Sometimes on projects I end up filling up detail areas with Bondo, and it's not even that big of a deal because it's so easy to sand or pull a pick through. I can usually get a lot of that detail back. When you are sanding, I recommend going back and forth in like a waving motion. Don't go forward and back along the lines of your fingers because you can definitely sand finger lines into the print. If you're going back and forth like the motion you do when waving to somebody, you can apply a lot of pressure and you won't really have any finger lines start to show up because you got all 4 of your fingers running along it. I do find that sanding in a circle is a good way to do it too, but I think that back and forth waving motion is probably the best. On a big project like this with all these little intricate pieces and all the details, I really do think sanding twigs are your friend. I use sanding twigs a lot on the gauntlets, on the jetpack. Oh, see, I called them gauntlets. But anyway, you know what I mean. There's just lots of little details and edges, and it makes it much easier if you have sanding twigs as an option. For areas that were super stubborn, I did use a file a lot as well on this project. I also want to discuss too that partway through this project, I did purchase a resin printer, the Elegoo Saturn S. And so a lot of the smaller pieces, like some of the jetpack detailing or the attachment pieces that I needed to add to the van braces, I did have those started with normal PLA and I was starting the smoothing process, but I ended up deciding to totally ditch those and just resin print them, because essentially, after I print them in resin, there was no sanding needed at all. I will say that the back piece and the jetpack probably needed the most smoothing. The jetpack was a ton of work because it had all those weld lines, which require tons of extra sanding and smoothing anyway, but then it also has all those details. The back piece I could just fill with Bondo and then sand it and fill it again and sand it, and I basically did that till the back piece was good. But the jetpack has so many details that I also needed to preserve. Those sanding twigs came in super handy along the upper rim of the jetpack. And also the curve towards the top of the jetpack had really bad stair stepping. I had to go over that with Bondo several times. The little patch piece for the jetpack was pretty easy to smooth on its own. I think I did like 1 layer of Bondo, a layer of filler primer, and then I just did some patchy Bondo on some areas that needed it, sanded it down and called it good. I then glued that piece onto the jetpack. Smoothing the jetpack before you glue that piece on does make it a lot easier, because you have a lot longer, flatter pieces that you're able to work with and sand on, whereas if you glued that patch on earlier, it would kind of just get in the way and make it harder to smooth everything. All of the sanding can get super boring, it's a very repetitive process, and it is really one of those things that's totally up to you and how smooth you want your pieces to be. I will once again remind you that this version of Boba Fett is very textured, so it really helps limit the amount of time you have to spend sanding. Other cosplay projects like The Mandalorian require a perfectly smooth finish before you can apply any paint. Well, I really appreciate you sticking around till the end of the video. Please hit that like button if you gained something from this video, and go ahead and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of these. I do have lots of other videos planned, but the next ones in the Boba Fett series are going to be a brief tutorial on using fiberglass resin to reinforce your armor and make it stronger, and then I'll start getting into the soft parts, the way I finished the resin printed pieces, of course painting everything, some of the modifications I did to the soft parts, and on and on. I really do hope you stick around for the rest of this series. I hope to see you in future videos. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a good one.